protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. And we are at the Bank of Baroda, Mughal tent. We are delighted to introduce this poem, Will Provoke You. This session is presented by The Week. In a session of readings and conversations, writer, poet, translator, and activist Meena Kandasamy takes us along on an arduous journey navigating through the dimensions of self, politics, and gender. She has authored critically acclaimed works of poetry, prose, and translation, such as The Gypsy Goddess, This Poem Will Provoke You, When I Hit You, Exquisite Cadavers, The Orders, Were to Rape You, and Women Dreaming, a vibrant and scintillating conversation between Kandasamy and Manasi Subramanyam, associate publisher at Penguin Press, where they speak of the weight of words, beliefs, ideologies, and the space in between. Meena is an anti-caste activist, poet, novelist, and translator. She deconstructs trauma and violence, most notably in her books of poems, Touch and Ms Militancy, as well as her other 3 novels. Her latest work is a collection of essays called The Orders Were to Rape You, Tamil Tigresses in the Eelam Struggle. Her novels have been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, International Dylan Thomas Prize, Jhalak Prize, and the Hindu Lit Prize. Manasi Subramanyam is associate publisher and head of rights at Penguin Random House, India. Please welcome them both.
So thank you for braving this very hot afternoon and coming to the session. We promise to provoke you, or at least be thought-provoking, because being provocative doesn't always have to be a bad thing. But before we get into the semantics of provocation, we would love to give you a sampler of the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about. And I think there's no better way to do that than by asking Meena to read to us the poem after which the session is named. This poem will provoke you.
This poem was written, I think, a little bit after the controversy around Penguin's publication of Wendy Doniger's book on Hinduism. So it's called #This Poem Will Provoke You. This poem is not a Hindu. This poem is eager to offend. This poem is shallow and distorted. This poem is a non-serious representation of Hinduism. This poem is a haphazard presentation. This poem is riddled. This poem is a factual inaccuracy. This poem has missionary zeal. This poem has a hidden agenda. This poem denigrates Hindus. This poem shows them in poor light. This poem concentrates on the negative aspects of Hinduism. This poem concentrates on the evil practices of Hinduism. This poem asserts its moral rights to use objectionable words for gods. This poem celebrates Krishna's freedom to perch on a naked woman. This poem flames with the fires of a woman hungry of sex. This poem supplies sexual connotations. This poem puts the phallus back into the picture. This poem makes the Shiva Lingam the male sexual organ. This poem does not make the above-mentioned organ erect. This poem prides itself in its perverse mindset. This poem shows malice to Hinduism for untouchability and misogyny. This poem declares the absence of a Hindu canon. This poem declares itself the Hindu canon. This poem follows the monkey. This poem worships the horse. This poem supersedes the Vedas and the supreme scriptures. This poem does not culture the jungle. This poem jungles the culture. This poem storms into temples with tanks. This poem stands corrected. The RSS is BJP's mother. This poem is not vulnerable. This poem is section 153A proof. This poem is also idiot proof. This poem quotes Dr. Ambedkar. This poem considers Ramayana a heteronormative novel. This poem breaches section 295A of the Indian Penal Code. This poem is pure and total blasphemy. This poem is a voyeur. This poem gossips. This poem is a witness to the rape of Shurpanaka. This poem smears Rama for a suspicious mind. This poem was once forced into sati. This poem is now taking her revenge. This poem is addicted to eating beef. This poem knows the caste of all the 33 million Hindu gods. This poem got court summons for switching the castes of gods. This poem once dated Karna, who was sure he was no test tube baby. This poem is not curious about who was the father. This poem is horizontally flipped. This poem is a plagiarized version. This poem is selectively chosen. This poem is running paternity tests on Hindutva. This poem saw Godse of the RSS kill Gandhi. This poem is not afraid of being imprisoned. This poem does not comply to client demands. This poem is pornographic. This poem will not tender an unconditional apology. This poem will not be penguined. This poem will not be pulped. It's quite surreal with the penguin editor.
Thank you. That was beautiful. That was a beautiful reading, and it's a very provocative poem. But let's start with poetry itself. Why poetry? Why do we choose poetry? Why do you choose poetry? What does poetry mean to us?
I think I started writing poetry precisely because of a lack of proper language to do anything else. So I was working with this tiny NGO, and we would go on these fact-finding missions, and they were running a little magazine called The Dalit at this time. This was 2002, before Facebook, before Twitter or social media. So it became important to kind of document caste atrocities, document police repression, and little things happening in these little pockets. And you would go there, largely NGOs would be going there, and they would write these fact-finding missions. So you would read the report of this fact-finding, or you read newspaper reports, and nothing carried, I think, the emotional stress and sadness that you feel when you actually are confronted with injustice, confronted with this kind of oppression. So the language would be so tame, it would be so sanitized, it would be so, you do not even blame like who is doing what. It just is an objective, chronicle of what was happening. And then so poetry started happening to me as, this place where I would put all my anger, put all my emotions. It was not necessarily meant for publication. Sometimes I wish I had kept it to myself. But, so that's where poetry started, I think, just as a young person, not knowing what to do with the anger that I was feeling and finding somewhere the words to articulate them. But I also think there was the immense influence of somebody like Kamala Das, who was so growing up, a lot of things. You still can access politics, you can still access news, you can still access political movements, but you still don't know how to access what it means to feel desire in a woman's body, what it means to inhabit this woman's body. And I think that reading someone like Kamala Das also gives you the go ahead to be a poet. It also tells, okay, this is a fraternity you want to be part of. This is who I want to be. I think there were definitely influences.
There's a very strong literary tradition of the poetry of protest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also what you're kind of referring to here. I wonder do you think all art, including poetry and maybe even specifically poetry, is political?
All my art is political. So I would like to start on that note. But I also think that if you are like today sitting in India and deciding to write, let's say, about, I don't know what is not political. I would say, okay, you're writing about the flowers in this wall, but like writing about nature immediately brings you to the larger question, climate change, like how long are we going to see real flowers? So I don't know, like everything is intrinsically related to what is happening around us. So it's very difficult for me at least, to divorce the political aspect of things from the articulation of them in, an accessible or in a intense or moving or emotional form, or whatever it is that poetry does, the persuasive form, for instance. So at least for me, I can't take them separately and say, okay, there's something that's not political. Like someone else was asking me 2 days ago, do you think there can be non-political poems? And I said, yes, there can be love poems, which, can exist without context. But then love is also so politicized where we live, so where do you draw the line?
Yeah. Maybe all the personal is political, and increasingly the domestic is a political space. For you in particular, have you ever then considered the possibility that your poetry can give offense?
I would like to possibly come up with read a little bit. So this was when Ms Militancy was published, and it had a lot of these. So it was a reworking of Hindu and Tamil myths and manner, and I knew right at the beginning when I was working on this project that it would be seen as offensive by a lot of people. And so I was like, but why would you take offense? The question was, what is it that makes you offended? And I wrote a little bit I couldn't address that in a poem, so I wrote a little bit of a preface. So I just read a few lines from it. Should you take offense? You are the repressed ram from whom I run away repeatedly. You are Indra busy causing bloodshed. You are Brahma fucking up my fates. You are Manu robbing me of my right to live and learn and choose. Your sage Gautama turning your wife to stone. Your Adi Shankara driving me to death. You're all the men for whom I would never mourn, never mourn. You are the conscience of this Hindu society. Your myths put me in my place. Therefore, I take perverse pleasure in such deliberate paraphrase. I am no atheist. I allow everyone in existence. It is just that I struggle with any story that has stayed the same for way too long. So my Mahabharata moves to Las Vegas. My Ramayana is retold in 3 different ways. I'm unconventional, but when I can choose to, I carry tradition. Telling my story another way lets me forgive you. Twisting your story to the scariest extent allows me the liberty of trying to trust you. I work to not only get back at you, I actually fight to get back to myself. I do not write into patriarchy. My Mariamma bays for blood. My Kali kills. My Draupadi strips. My Sita climbs onto a stranger's lap. All my women militate. They brave bombs. They belittle kings. They take on the sun. They take after me. So this was where it was coming from. You know, the need to reclaim, the need to exist, but also exist in the version that I wanted for myself.
There are 2 things that came up in the section that you read, and I think they're inextricably linked to offense, or the giving and the taking of offense. Your Kalis and your Mariammas and your Draupadis are women. Your book is called Ms Militancy. Your women militate. And I think that gender cannot be extricated in any way from the way in which people try to silence the militation and agitation and protest of through prose, through poetry, through all manner of platforms. How important is it to you to recreate that in your poetry, to bring gender into your poetry, for one thing, but also as a writer writing very political material and a woman, how are you separating the domestic and the political, or do you need to separate the domestic and the political?
This is an interesting question, because I have been fascinated with not just questions of women within poetry, but also women who take up arms but also end up being poets, or women who are poets who end up taking up arms, like especially as it happens with the Tamil Tigers. So when at some point there were the Tamil Tigresses formed at least 1/3 of the fighting force of the LTTE. So the question is, and several of them were poets. So the question is, what does it mean to be a female militant who is also a female poet? So why does a woman who loves the beauty of poetry, who can write about flowers and bees and butterflies, someone who appreciates all of these little things of nature, why does she become a killing machine? Or why does she want to wage this struggle? Why does she believe in some kind of violence? Even if it's a counter violence, even if it's a violence against hegemonic state oppression or state terror. So I think these are questions that have been fascinating to me, especially growing up as a young Tamil woman. And so I think that some of it does come from there. But as a writer, what does it mean I find the fact that you're a woman writer, it's inevitable that you write about gender precisely because you're boxed into that category. But also precisely because so much of oppression or oppression or stereotyping, whatever you choose to call it, happens because you happen to be a woman, like there's certain, it's easy to dismiss you because you're a woman, or and I just don't even know how to start unpacking it. There are so many levels of it. And I also think that when you're a woman, you're expected to talk only about a certain number of things. So you're not too political. You can be a little bit political. So, yeah, that is again something I feel very conflicted about, and which I feel that as women we have to reclaim the space of being at the center of political debates, like not have to be happy being at the margins, but saying that, oh no, this is our perspective, but this is really important to what is going on around here. And I think that for instance, coming from Tamil Nadu, like the whole self-respect movement, or the Periyar movement, or subsequent Dravidian platforms, I think Periyar, a lot of he's unfortunately known for being a Brahmin basher, but a lot of his work is actually he's about 5 or 6 volumes on just women's liberation, on the right to abortion, on the right to remarriage, the right to divorce. So he was putting women at the front and center of the struggle. And why was he doing that? Because unless you change the way women are treated, you cannot change society. So you look at Dr. Ambedkar's work, you look at Periyar's work, they really understand how fundamental it is to make women equals in order to fight for a just society. And I think it's the same whether you're writing poetry, prose, novels, or you're doing political propaganda. You realize sooner than later that women have a very essential role in the transformation of society. So,
and in that same vein, I think the other thing that possibly cannot be extricated from the business of causing offense is also from the piece that you just read, religion. I think the giving offense to religious sentiments and taking offense on the basis of religious sentiments is perhaps a great threat to your freedom, your right to freedom of expression as a poet and as a writer in general. How do we even begin to unpack the process of separating some of these things? Religion, we talked about gender, and I don't think there's a need to take gender out of the equation, but sometimes I think there is a need to take religion out of the equation.
So the question is, if I understand right, the question is about religion is a soft spot in which people get upset easily, or they worked up easily. No, I agree. There's no way one cannot agree. But I also think that, at some point, especially if you look at Tamil history, like the Shaivites, or what you call present-day Hindus, were fighting for their own freedom of religion. So, you have a 7th century poet like Appar, or Tirunavukkarasar as he's called, and Mahendra Varman is the ruler at the time. He's a Jain Pallava emperor, and he doesn't want anybody who's Shaivite to be, to spread the religion. So he says that, Appar Tirunavukkarasar must be dragged to his court. So he goes to him and, he sends his people for the arrest of Tirunavukkarasar. And Tirunavukkarasar actually says, these are very famous lines. I read them the other day at a poetry reading. Namarkum kudiyallom namanai anjom, naragathil idalpadom nadalai illom. So what he means is that we are not your subjects. Namarkum kudiyallom namanai anjom, we are not afraid of death. Naragathil idalpadom nadalai illom. So even if I'm going to go through hellfire, I'm not a coward. So this is basically what Hinduism was fighting for at some point. But so today it's the same religion which has become, the oppressor, which becomes, at least as Hindutva, and especially as Hindutva 2.0, becomes so intolerant of other people. So you people were fighting for your own right to follow your own religion when you were not, in power. So how quickly we forget and how quickly power changes. So I don't think that, I think especially as Hindus, as somebody who's born a Hindu, whether you can help it or not, it's also a time for us to, if we want religion to survive, if we want Hinduism to survive in some form, shape, whatever, maybe some quaint, cute aspect, you find Shiva interesting, or you find some story interesting, we really have to take a very close look at the caste system and how we are going to get rid of it. How do we annihilate the system in order to go to the next level? How do we get rid of, all of this misogyny which is inbuilt into the religion? How do we get rid of this control of women, which is inbuilt into our religion. So this can be possible because I think that every religion, like even Periyar started out as a Hindu reformer. So, in early Periyar in the 1920s says, why do you let so many women be widows? Like child widows under 5, you have like tens of thousands of them. Shouldn't widows be allowed remarriage so that the Hindu population is maintained intact? So this is Periyar, so it's possible to reform this religion in, at least that's what a lot of people believed. So if Hinduism has to survive, it has to really get the caste system out. So, and I think these are questions. So how can you take offense if somebody is upset that, it's an unequal religion, if people are criticizing you for being a misogynist religion? So these are questions that unless you have this kind of self-reflexivity and you want to change from within, I think that's what's, if you really think it's a way of living, that's what you do. On the other hand, people would argue that no, our way of living is having inequality. Our way of living is putting women as, secondary citizens. Then so be it, you're going to self-destruct.
But they don't word it that way. They don't word it as our way of living is to put women down. They will find more intelligent ways of couching what they actually mean. So, and we've talked quite a bit about the right to give offense. But what about the right to take offense? When someone says exactly the thing that you said, that our way of living is to oppress certain castes or certain genders, if is an incitement of violence sometimes. Where do we draw the line between it is okay to give offense, but also sometimes it is okay to take offense?
This is Manasi asking me a very tricky question. I don't know. I don't know, Manasi. I think the interesting thing is that okay, you're giving offense because you're fighting against injustice, right? So I think this is a proper kind of offense to be given. Like, we want an equal world. So what is my aim there? But sometimes you read the Manusmriti and, you read chapter 9 of the Manusmriti, which says that, the wise do not, women are given to are basically temptresses. So that's why the wise man would not sit next to his mother or even his sister or his daughter, because that's how bad women are. So there's this whole idea that, I can just pull out verses and read it, but I'm not going to do that. So how can somebody reduce women into this kind of thing? So saying that, so I think that's very offensive. If you're a woman and you're seen as, all of this, then I think then you have the right to take offense. Or the denial of education to women, for instance, women of all castes, women of all backgrounds, or the denial of education to Shudras. And sometimes, sometimes, well, not sometimes, very rarely Brahmin men do come up to me and they're big fans. And I'm like, you know what the Manusmriti says about a Brahmin man shagging a Shudra woman even for a day or even for a night? Basically says your ancestors will rot in shit for a month. Are you willing to pay this price? The men I've been with have said they're willing to pay the price, but that's what their religion says. That's what their book says. So how can you be not offended?
Yeah.
Like you'd be offended if you're a man, you'd be offended if you're the woman. But that's literally what the Manusmriti says. And this is part of why, not exactly why, but this is part of our society's extreme intolerance towards intercaste couples, towards intercaste marriages, and which is also why we end up as a society doing honor killings, for instance.
So how does something like love come into the framework of this? Intercaste marriages, interreligion marriages are all built on an extraordinary base of love. And we just said earlier that when we spoke about whether all art is political, we said maybe love is an exception, but sometimes love is also not an exception. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with love poetry and some of the translation work that you've been doing as well.
Oh yeah, this is interesting. So I do write a lot of love poetry, which is from personal experience, which also is something I feel very shy. The more older I get, I feel really shy because it becomes very transparent. Like if people who know who is in your life, then they can really map the particular poem to the person. So you feel like you're not only letting like not only so transparent as to let people read you, but also people read the others in your life. So yeah, and at 8 or 19 or 20 or even 25, I was so forthright about reading them in public. Now I really blush because because I don't know, I'm like, yeah, bringing in others. So I'm a big fan of writing about love. I've written a lot of my poems, but recently I started doing the work of translating the Tirukural, which is this classic 2000-year-old Tamil text, which contains the last 25 chapters are on love. So that's about 250 poems on love. And I realized when I was translating that the text has not had any previous female translator. So that's 2000 years and no women translators. And then also you realize that those who have translated it happen to be either Tamil scholars or they happen to be religious reformers or missionaries. So they all also sanitize the text. And when Valluvar is speaking only about lovers, they would make them husband and wife or something like this. So the text I thought needed a little bit of rescuing, which is how I came to translating the Tirukural. So
that let's
Manasi is Penguin is publishing this later, I think. So possibly
yes,
for next Lovers Day.
Yeah. Watch out, February 2023, we will be publishing Meena's translations of the third section of the Tirukural, the Book of Love. But let's also talk about translation, because I think translation is an incredibly political activity. You've translated Salma, whose poetry has given offense, who has received all manner of threats for the poetry and the prose that she has written. And you've translated her wonderful novel, Manamiyangal. What does translation mean to you?
So translation for me was literally how I made my baby steps into the world of books. So I was about 18 at the time. And I met this Tamil political leader who is the founder president of the Vidudalai Chiruthaigal Katchi, so the Liberation Panthers Party, Thirumavalavan. And he said to me, I was really, according to me, a very frivolous young person. And I had met him with my father and my parents. And he said, why don't you translate my work? I have written these essays for India Today on caste and all this. And I was like so surprised that somebody would take me seriously enough to ask me to translate a book of political essays. I didn't have the heart to say no, because if someone takes you seriously in your life for the first time, how do you react? I didn't even have the heart to tell him that I only studied Hindi and English at school. So Tamil was my mother tongue, but I had never studied it like in a formal manner. I said, yes, I will do it. And then I did this book. So that was my first book published when I was 19. And then at 20, I did his political speeches. And then at 23, I did Periyar's translation. So Periyar was big because it was this book called Why Were Women Enslaved? Is literally published like 100 years ago in the 1920s. A really powerful tract. So I did a lot of translation before I came into my own writing. And I think it kind of made me extremely aware of, what's happening in the grassroots. What does it mean? What's the history of my own people, of the Tamil people? What's the history of the anti-caste movement there? What's the history of the feminist movement there? So it kind of gives you this grounding. But also, I think translation, like I'll come to Salma in just a second, but also what translation does to you as a writer is that you have to choose every word right, because you don't want to mix the meanings. And I think that kind of obsessing about words makes you a good poet as well, because again, when you're a poet, you're hunting for the right word, you're hunting to make sure you get it right. So I think this is the background where I was coming from. I think with Salma, it's very interesting because like a lot of us were feminist writers, we love her work. But then there's also this other aspect, which is that, like Muslim men, for instance, would come and say, don't you think this work is like Islamophobic? And Salma's work. And then because, there's this Muslim man at the center of the story who is very abusive, Hassan, right? He's abusive towards his wife. He happens to follow religion so closely. And therefore, he uses, the stick of religion to beat the women in his life, so to say, So, and actually, the person who best answered this for me was Salma herself. She said, this is not the political climate I was writing this book into. So Salma's opinion was that, at the moment, Muslims are so much under an Islamophobic regime that I would not have written this book to cause criticism. So now I stand with my own people. But these are criticisms and these are conversations we should be having internally with ourselves, because, the problem just doesn't go away. So I think she's so mature and she's so brilliant that, she can even distance herself from her work and say this kind of thing. And I think I really loved her for it. So, and translating Salma is also very beautiful because, you think you're a Tamil speaker, which you are, but then Salma brings you this tiny universe of Tamil women from a small village in the south. And we don't even have like matching words for curry. Like what we would call curry in Tamil is not the word she would use, And then I had to call her up and ask her about all of these things. So it was very interesting.
So Meena's translation of Salma's book is published as Women
It's
Dreaming. It's a really wonderful novel. But one of the greatest joys I had from reading that novel is how brilliantly Meena translates slang. Slang is such an important, integral part of Salma's writing. She uses a lot of curse words with great efficiency. And these are the kinds of things that one might think would cause offense. But in Salma's case, she's taking ownership of the language, of the right to use cuss words against men very often. And you're a novelist as well. So Meena, you're a translator, you're a poet, you've written very political non-fiction, but you've also written incredibly political fiction. As a novelist, how do you make that transition from like you're writing into a specific space when you're writing fiction, non-fiction or poetry or translation, but when it comes to fiction, you're creating your own little world. And the Gypsy Goddess is one of the most political novels I've ever read, and it's absolutely brilliant. I'm very, very interested in understanding how you wear these many hats and what provocations you deal with in the writing of these very different genres.
I would take this as two questions. The first about Salma and cuss words. So, because I really urge you all to pick up a copy of Salma's book. Because as much as, one is a writer and happy to shine in one's own light, I also think it's so much important that, there's a very unfair privilege, unfair disadvantage when you write in English. And part of my responsibility is to tell people, read Tamil writers in translation, read Periyar in translation, read Salma in translation, read Thiruma in translation, read Valluvar in translation, read all of them, because these are the people who enrich you, people from where I come, so I would ask you to pick it up. So Salma is really beautiful, and she reminds me of all Tamil mothers, which is that, they're very devout, but they're also like, their curses are so coarse. So Salma, there's a character where this woman is angry that her son-in-law has taken a second wife. So she talks to Allah. She says, "Oh Allah, why don't you give any justice? This cunt son is roaming around with his second wife, making her sit next to him in the car." So right in the sentence, we have this, entreaty to Allah. At the same time, even as she's addressing God, she talks about her son-in-law as like this cunt son, this whore son. So she, like the way in which she can marry the devotion to God, the prayer to God, at the same time being absolutely bad-mouthed and blasphemous. I think I really love this combination and co-location that she uses. And she uses it all through the text. And I think that's one of the ways in which women wrest power as well. Because what do you do in a society that silences you? So what is the provocative? We are talking about my poem being provocative, but don't women use provocation all the time? And using bad language is that kind of taking up ownership and saying, I have the right to provoke you because I'm so oppressed and because this is the only right that's allowed to me. I think so. And the second question is, how does political fiction work? So I think Gypsy Goddess is, earlier we were both, I and Manasi were sitting and having this little chat on what gives offense and what does not. And I said, what art is political, what's not a political. And I said, sometimes it's not only that literature has to be written for it to cause offense. Like sometimes there are gaps in our society, in our literature, in our teaching, in our understanding that give offense. Like I went to school for 12 years. And in school, I never learned about the caste atrocities taking place around us. We learn about the independence struggle. We don't learn about Kilwin money. So in Kilwin money, 44 landless agricultural laborers 19 of them women, 25 of them children, are burnt to death in a single hut because they're asking for higher wages. And what is the higher wage? They basically want, this measure of rice, like half a bottle of rice. And for this, because they're fighting for such a small right, they're basically burned to death. They're organizing against under the red flag. So I think this is also offensive. What is offensive here is the way you can completely gloss over, completely elate something, completely pretend that it did not happen. And how offensive is that to people from this region, the women who lost their lives, the men who lost their lives, the communist movement itself, and the Dalits of the village of Kilvanmani. So I think that sometimes you have to know that there is an absence and claim that absence. Also because I think for me, Venmani was a very political project. Even if it took many years to write it, I think partly because I was a poet. And for me, as a poet, every sentence had to come to perfection, which I think is a poet's obsession. I don't think real novelists do that. When you're a poet novelist, you take on this burden for yourself, which is not a nice thing to do. So yeah, you turn over each sentence till it's perfect. So it took me 7 years to write. I have no regrets because I would only do that novel once. So, but also the thing is, it was like if you're writing the history of the communist movement in India, the history of land struggle in India, nobody puts Dalit people as the major people who sacrificed with their lives. Nobody says they are the leaders. We look at leaders as people who wrote books. We think the leadership comes from theory. We think the leadership comes from those who have great theoretical contributions. We don't think leadership comes from actual on the ground grassroots organizing and laying down your lives for that. So for me, it was like, this is leadership and this is where we are going to go and get the story. And also I went there knowing obviously that this is a story of Dalit militancy, of Dalits holding up the red flag. But what I discovered was the role that women played in all of this. So they were really like, even among the Dalits, they were the ones who were leading the protest, because all the men would run away when the police came. So, but it was left to the women to organize. So I felt that I was kind of reclaiming a certain bit of history. So this is where the political fiction came from. So
I don't want to suggest that there's a hierarchy of censorship, but I don't think that it is hyperbole to say that we are living in incredibly divisive times and intolerant times, and there are so many dangers to someone who is outspoken about the injustices in the world. And you've written about religion, you've written about caste, you've written about gender and sex, you've written about politics. And these are all dangerous subjects to be writing about, and I applaud you for your courage. But what would you say is the greatest threat to our civilization right now? Which of these subjects would you say is in the most danger?
I think we live in a time where it's very difficult to unpack this question. Like, as a young woman who started writing out, let's say about 20 years ago, my first instinct would be to say writing about sex and writing about gender. It does call for, it doesn't cause any threat to you, but it causes a lot of character assassination. So it's easy to, say, oh, she writes about sex and gender, therefore she's a loose woman, quote unquote. So they would say all of these and, just put you in a box. Does it cause danger to your physical self? No. Does it take away your sense of physical self? Yes, it does. Does it ruin relationships for you? Does it ruin your perception? I think it does ruin your perception. And I suffered. I did not have anyone to guide me. So there was no writers in my family or anywhere to tell me what to do. So if somebody had given me that amount of guidance, I might have actually not written about sexuality at all. Because when you write about sexuality, you're not taken with intellectual rigor. So people don't assume that, just because you write about sex, they don't think that, oh, she's a Marxist, or, she would have something important to say on, important questions of the day, or what does she think about the political economy of Tamil Nadu? Like, these are questions people don't want to come to you for, because you're like, oh, she's the one who writes about sex. So in a sense, writing about sex damages you, because you still have to fight very hard to claim intellectual space. So I don't think it's a danger, except that it does lead to stereotyping. I think writing about caste leads to a lot of threat because we saw that happen with Perumal Murugan.
Yeah.
So even though they largely were fighting under the rubric of religion, they were saying Hindus were offended, but it was a very particular subgroup of Hindus who claimed offense. And I think when it comes to caste, it's also easy to, I would use caste and religion interchangeably where it comes to Hinduism, like sometimes caste sentiments are offended, which takes on the guise of religion. So I think with Perumal Murugan's example, we really saw that happen. It was caste offense that claimed or paraded itself as religious offense. And then, but I think at the moment, my personal experience is tweeting after the beef festival in Osmania University in 2012. So I just said, I was at this beef festival. It was a good, awesome experience. And then I got all these threats of, televised gang rape and threats of acid attacks. And recently I was speaking at this conference on dismantling global Hindutva or something. And I don't know, like my topic was like, I think very run of the mill, but even before I spoke at the conference, there was threats against my children.
Yeah.
So saying that, your son will die a painful death. He's 4 years old. I don't know what make them, go after him. So what I'm trying to say is that, religion is at this point the most inflammatory, if we may say so. So it does, you might have to think twice. At least they have put you in a position where you have to think twice before you say anything on religion, because they want to show that the repercussions are that much more.
So we have a little bit of time for audience questions. I think there are mics going around. Let's all, to paraphrase Voltaire briefly, let's all defend to death Meena's right to both take offense and give offense. Let that be a kind of oath that we make as a team over here. I see a gentleman over there with his, yeah.
Yeah, I was very interested when you said, why aren't the mass movements of Dalits recognized as the leadership of the material movements that have overtaken India and the Communist Party? I think that the answer is fairly clear. It's that people like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Putin, Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping said that they have to be leaders of a communist party that then sets out cadres to suppress opposition where they can see it. And if that has happened, the mass movements, that's not what Marx envisaged. Marx really said that the mass movement of a proletariat will actually overtake and give us socialistic advance. Lenin, Trotsky, etc., went against quite that and formed leadership parties, which then took control of the country and the movement. And I'm very interested. I think it's very brave of you to write these poems which attack the political profile of India today. Would you say the same about the suppression of opinion and the suppression of people, shall we say, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia?
Mr. Tondi, was there a specific question that you wanted her to?
I wanted her to say that she condemns the same kind of suppression of opinion and the suppression of opposition in places such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia. Because it's all very well, the kind of oppression that goes on in these places is, as far as I can see, almost worse than what we experience in which is bad enough, which we experience in the India in which we live.
Thanks. This is a very surreal moment because I really look up to you, and thanks for engaging. So my answer to the, you were right in terms of, mass movements and leadership and the left tradition of, looking at the, even though I think Lenin was against it at some point, saying that, it doesn't mean an intellectual has to be an intellectual, you can have organic intellectuals. But coming to this question of, do I write about the suppression of the freedom of expression in Moscow? I think I'm in solidarity. I also think that my partner is Trotskyist, and I think we have a very interesting division of labor. So he does all the internationalism work, and I do what? So, and I do all the local regional work. So yeah, I don't really step that much outside my own what I'm really aware of and familiar with. Also because this is about 20 years of being in touch with the grassroots movement. So what I know best, I write about. Even though when I was living in London, like a lot of people, I was really taken in by Corbyn's brand of politics. I joined the Labour Party for some time. So, I was trying to get involved, but I don't think it's still the same to be an immigrant who just recently joins politics and tries to understand what is going on there. But I do understand what it means to be writing and talking about these far-flung places. So my partner is always about something going on in Sudan or something happening in Yemen that, for instance, the company called Total did not pay its workers because of the war in Yemen. And then we would all go and hold posters outside Total's offices in London. There would be 6 or 5 of us. But I don't know if that really causes change. But at the same time, I do think that, we have to talk about oppression and the right to freedom of expression everywhere. I think, yeah, possibly I'm having a very limited canvas because I'm speaking about India. But then it's still a nation of 1 billion people. So it adds up, I guess.
Any
That's
other
question there at the back?
Yeah, there's a hand over there in the back. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My question was to you as a woman. If you had to put a number to it, how much do you think you channel the voice of a female collective as opposed to your own personal voice? And if you had to put a number to it, how much of hardship you faced as a woman before writing and how much after writing, since you're writing? Is there any new challenge you faced? You already talked about that, but if you have to put numbers to these things.
Oh, I'm bad with numbers. My mother is a mathematician and I left mathematics because I couldn't do numbers. No, I think the question of women's collective is very important. Recently, I am thinking of joining politics at some point. So I was talking to a friend in a radical Dalit party saying that, what do you think about the participation of women, in these Dalit spaces, in these anti-caste movement spaces, and especially given how much character assassination we face, especially if you're poets or writers or outspoken women. And then he had a very interesting question about numbers as well. He said that, just because there are very few women, like, there are 2 or 3 women in politics, it becomes easy for them to, say all of these things about you. But what if you were the majority? What if on a stage, like you were the majority, not just on a stage? What if in the movement itself, you were the majority? What if each of you did not come to a protest, just one of you, but you brought along 100 of your friends? Would any man then be able to say anything about you? Because all of you would just, target him, would just have to shut him up. And I think this question of numbers is very important. Not that we are a collective, but I think one has to get there. One has to mobilize far more women into politics, right from the grassroots, in order to make any kind of equitable presence or any kind of feminist politics possible at all. So I do think that as a writer, you are an individual, even though in order to legitimize both your existence, but also to write from the ground. I'm always, very adjacent to political movements, whether it's the Periyarist movement or whether it's the Liberation Panthers in Tamil Nadu. So I try to be as close to them as possible. At the same time, I do find that, women's participation must increase. The second question, what is the second question about numbers? Oh, do I feel better after being a writer, as a woman writer? I don't know. I just think that being a writer also means being in the public domain, and therefore you face much more. Like if you are not so much outside, if you're not so exposed, I think you'd face far less harassment. It's not even a question of being a writer. Like it's also a question of just being on Twitter. So what does it mean being on Twitter? Forget your writing. You write one wrong tweet and then everybody's after you. So It's a question of, I think, exposure. So how do you deal with exposure is the question, I think. So.
Unfortunately, I'm told we've run out of time,
Okay.
but Meena will be signing copies, and maybe
Yeah, I can
if you
check
have
the
any
questions
specific
there.
questions, you can ask her directly.
Thank you, Mansi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meena and Manasi, for a very immersive session. And we also thank the week for supporting this session, as also all the audiences out here. Thank you.